Hello and welcome to Silicon Valley Innovation Center. Here at SVIC, we promote discussion on technology and business innovation through our executive immersion programs and our online events. I'm Rahim Rahimtullah, SVIC brand ambassador. Today I'm talking to Geoff Tuff and Steve Goldbach of Deloitte about challenging orthodox business playbooks in this era of technological disruption that we find ourselves in today. This comes ahead of a webinar Geoff and Steve are going to be doing for us in October 9th, to be precise. I want to remind you that if you have questions for Geoff and Steve today, you can send those in to us in real time via the comments section of whichever platform you're watching us through. So a little bit more about my guests today. Apart from being innovation and business strategy consultants, they're also co-authors. They wrote together, it came out earlier this year. Its title is Detonate: Why and How Corporations Need to Blow Up Best Practices and Bring a Beginner's Mind to Survive. So I'm delighted to say that Geoff and Steve are with us now to say more. Gentlemen, thank you very much both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Before we get into the ideas, the recommendations in your book, I want to talk a little bit about the context that it's appeared in. Broadly speaking, I think we could say that this book is a call for businesses to challenge orthodox thinking. And you say that we need this now more than ever because of the technological disruption that we see today. But so first, tell us a little bit more about this period that we're going through, about this tech disruption. Is there a period in time that you can say where it began? Or is there perhaps an idea or a concept that we look back now and we can see, oh yeah, this was when, you know, this technological era of disruption that we're living through, this is when it really started. Can we say that?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing I'd say about technological disruption is we don't always feel as though we're being disrupted when it's happening. And so it's interesting you ask about the era and when all of this, the nature of change today started. Actually, you can extrapolate Moore's law all the way back to over 100 years ago. And what we've been able to see is that over the course of time, as we all know from Moore's law, the rate of computing power has been increasing exponentially. What's happened recently, and what is really leading to the context that we believe is so critical to pay attention to, and to pay attention to the ideas in the book Detonate, is that there's all sorts of other technologies that are now sitting on computing power that themselves are on exponential curves. And we're just now, at this point in time, I'd say really in the course of the last 2 to 3 years, we're just starting to see some of those technologies go past the knee of the curve so that we're no longer in that part of an exponential curve that feels very much like a linear curve. We're starting to see that, if you will imagine an exponential curve crossing a linear one, we're starting to see that impact in markets, in consumer habits, in anything that is related somehow to underlying digital technology. And so we're just now at the moment where the impact is starting to be felt. Yeah. And that's the dangerous condition we find ourselves in.
And the impact really has to do with not just the technology itself, but as Geoff said, it's all the technology upon the computing power, which in turn changes how people behave and what's possible. So it's the things that are now possible because of the combinations of those technologies that are accelerating some of the disruption to business models that we've seen, and the pace of that happening.
And do you think that this era of technological disruption is somehow fundamentally different from previous ones we've seen? For example, people sometimes call this period the fourth industrial revolution. We had, for example, in the original industrial revolution, we had steam engines, we had the spinning wheel. They caused a lot of disruption, a lot of upheaval, but ultimately progress. Is that essentially what we're going to see now, or is it because of this exponential growth in these technologies? Is that adding something different that we haven't seen before?
So I think it's very much the latter. It is something different. I agree to some extent that you can call the period that we're living in the fourth industrial revolution or the fourth manufacturing revolution, as a lot of people have, because we have seen in the past that there have been significant shifts in the way that companies can operate and the things that are available at their disposal to compete differently. And we're absolutely in the middle of one of those right now. What's different about this one from last ones, though, is that in the past, for the first, second, and third industrial revolutions, while the technologies at play have been different, the rate of change has been linear. And so companies had a chance to assess what was happening around them and to take action. And yes, it did feel like a revolution. They had to change significantly in order to keep up. But we're now in the first one of these revolutions where the rate of change is no longer linear, it is exponential. And the challenge that all of us find ourselves with is that we grew up in organizations that adapted and evolved linearly. We are as human beings wired to think in a linear fashion, and that's no longer going to be the way that you get by and the way that you outcompete anyone else in the market.
And currently then, we have, with these new technologies, I feel that we have sort of a funny dichotomy, because on the one side, for consumers, this feels like a really great era to be in, because we suddenly have so many things that were previously impossible that we can suddenly do from simply a few taps of a smartphone. Desires, wants, needs that we had, they can be satisfied so quickly now. Whereas on the other side, for businesses, this is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to navigate, and they don't necessarily know where to turn. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
That's a very fair assessment. And there's a component in the book which talks about the underlying cause of some of that, and that's the idea that what's happening is that consumers now have alternatives that they've never had before, and therefore they are changing their behavior. And so if you think about what business models have to do to respond, those behaviors are responding to stimulus in the marketplace, and either that stimulus is a better offer, a meaningfully better offer, an order of magnitude better. For example, I can, instead of going to the store to shop, I could, leverage the gig economy and have someone shop for me. That is an order of magnitude better than, just fixing the aisles in the store or improving the lighting or making the layout a little better. It's like, I don't have to do this chore that I used to have to do now. Or you can now, because of technology, deliver the same business model at a fraction of the cost. And so what once cost you a lot of money to do, now costs you a very little bit of money to do. And that's the essence of disruption, is something that makes the consumer's life, or the technology makes it possible for the consumer's life to be meaningfully different. And businesses that don't adapt to those new possibilities will eventually just become irrelevant to the consumer.
And the interesting thing about all of this, I think, is that any person within a company trying to operate, trying to get by, is themselves a consumer in some capacity. Obviously, the consumption varies, but if you think about the difference between how excited, as you put it, consumers are these days and how terrified businesses are, I think part of it is because consumers don't have some of the embedded inability to shift and to take advantage of new opportunities that organizations do. And I think it's probably because we as consumers, as we think about taking a taxi ride or ordering food, we're willing to take risks, to try something a little bit different, and then to be thrilled by the experience. There's all sorts of mechanisms that most organizations have that have to do with risk management that actually don't allow them to operate and to react to these new opportunities the way consumers do.
That's actually a really great analogy, Geoff. So if you imagine, the first time you tried a new business or a new product, that was relatively inexpensive, you said, well, what's the worst that can happen if I don't like it? I won't do it again, right? We don't have that same mentality at companies. We say, well, if something happens, then I might, my boss might, I might get fired, I might not get promoted, I might, not be liked anymore. And we have all of those mechanisms in the professional workplace that get in the way of taking that testing mentality to new things in an organization.
Absolutely. And of course, in your book, you refer to these, broadly speaking, as orthodoxies, which are sort of getting in the way of innovation. And your recommendation is, of course, so to speak, to detonate them. And so I think if we were, that brings us nicely here to this point where I'd ask you to explain a little bit what that means, detonate these orthodox business practices, because I think in some sense it sounds a little bit counterintuitive when we have this very uncertain world now that we find ourselves in. And sort of what you're saying is, in the face of this uncertainty, let's sort of throw in some more uncertainty. Let's not go with what we've been doing in the past and what we know has worked, but let's blow it all up and do something different. So why should that be the case?
Yeah. So do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just I think there's in your question, and I'll let Geoff talk about orthodoxies, but in your question, there's an inherent orthodoxy in the way you asked it that I just want to name, which is, isn't it risky because something's never happened before, right? Like it's inherently uncertain. And what the underlying assumption is that somehow it's not risky to continue to do things that we're doing. And if you fundamentally believe that we are in this fourth industrial revolution and things are going to be dramatically different, then what we're calling out is like, actually, it's incredibly risky to do the things that you're continuing to do and do them unwaveringly. But we don't even realize that. We're like the proverbial frog in the boiling water because it doesn't feel any riskier. It just simply is. And so what we want to do is blow up the mentality that says, doing what we've done before is somehow not risky, and that's the essence of orthodoxies.
Yeah, and I was, even before I get into orthodoxies, I would like to say that, as you might imagine, we chose this title very carefully. So detonate is meant to be a reference to controlled demolition. We're not saying go blow up everything. We're not saying completely get rid of all your different business models. We are saying look for, consistent with one of the themes of the book, look for minimally viable moves you can make in your business model to try to do things differently and to challenge orthodoxy. So orthodoxy is basically just it's another term really for conventional wisdom. Orthodoxy is just the way things have always been done around here. It's the way we think about our industry. It's the way we think about our competitors. It's the way we think about our competitive advantage. And the way most successful companies operate is that orthodoxy gets captured in the minds of the people, in the training manuals, in the playbooks for how the company operates. And it then becomes the way that the way that things are done. So an orthodoxy about how we do our strategic planning, for example, is that because we staple it to our financial plan, we do it once a year and we go through the process, and that then yields a budget. And that leads to the types of investments we can make, which in a world of linear change, such has been the case for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, is perfectly fine. And so we can capture the way things have been done in the past that have made us successful and continue to do them. The issue we've got, of course, is that because we're now in this exponential era and we're seeing change accelerate, what happened and what worked in the past no longer is going to work in the future. But we're not actually picking our heads up and saying, geez, I wonder why we do things this way. I wonder why we staple a strategic planning process to an annual financial forecast. And so the number one place that we recommend anyone starts as they do pick up their heads is to look around and say, why do we do things this way? It can be anything in the way that you operate. Why do we actually have this orthodoxy? Some orthodoxies are good. And I want to be very clear about that, for example, when you're talking about human safety or you're talking about regulatory constraints, some orthodoxies, the conventional wisdom, they're a reality of how you need to operate. But we're increasingly seeing that every company has a whole range of orthodoxies or conventional wisdom that can and should be challenged.
And I want to ask you, if you can, perhaps in your own consulting practice, I'm sure you've seen many examples of I hope, both sides of this coin. A, where orthodoxies have gotten in the way, and B, perhaps where you've seen companies who have really managed to, blow those up and do things differently. Can you share some examples of both of those scenarios?
Yeah, obviously, with the work that we do, we maintain high degrees of client confidentiality. So I'd rather, if it's okay, give an example of what we're doing at Deloitte, and a good example where we blew up conventional wisdom. And one of the things back in the start of the Great Recession that we had, what we like to describe as a great debate amongst the partnership was, we said one of the things that we want to do is invest deeply in the training of our people, even in the face of a recession coming up. And we face the choice: do we want to go with what we termed clicks, which was to do more of it online, to do more of it in a virtual capacity, or do we go with bricks, which was, do we do something a bit more old school and potentially build a campus which could be dedicated to the training of our people? And
the orthodoxy, if I could just name it there, as we considered that decision, was, should we do what conventional wisdom dictates, and that is look to leverage technology in a way where we can take cost out of our system, especially in the face of recession. And so orthodoxy would say, go clicks.
Right. And we said, actually, no, it's even more important in this world of technology and people not being face-to-face and being virtual, to invest in something that can bring our firm together in a cultural way, have rooted as one Deloitte, and that's been an immense success for us. It's one of the jewels that we all point to, that we say we love about this firm. And so it's a terrific example of where blowing up orthodoxy, doing the opposite of what conventional wisdom would say, was a great thing for a company to follow.
And what Steve's referring to is our spending hundreds of millions of dollars of partner capital to go and build Deloitte University in Texas, which is now our national training center for the U.S. firm.
And isn't it interesting how, in that case, blowing up an orthodoxy in this digital era actually meant turning away from technology and going back into the personalized world. And I suppose that illustrates how these ideas, these principles that you put forward in the book, where they lead you may not necessarily be where you think they think they're going to go.
Yeah, and the one thing I would say there is that what you always need to do is intuit what would be really delightful to the customers that you're trying to serve. And so, what we did when we built Deloitte University, we said, what would really delight the people in our firm to be able to get together and learn and become more collegial in a place that is just amazing. And we have to imagine how that might be different. But the common thread of this is that if you're always imagining what you could do to change the behavior of your customers, then that will lead you to better possible solutions every time.
And I think from reading the book, I understand human behavior, changing human behavior. That's one thing you come back to. One of the key principles that you come back to again and again, as something that companies need to look at as the subatomic particle, I believe is the phrase you use. And if you can influence that, that's going to lead to these the better outcomes. But can you give us a few more examples? I know there's, I believe, 3 other principles as well, key principles in the book that you talk about, but may not have time to go into all of them, but perhaps you could just share one or two more.
So why don't we talk about them as being thinking differently and then acting differently. So why don't I do the thinking, you can do the acting. How's that? So the behavioral one is actually a critical aspect. And when people ask us, where should we start? Which of these principles should we try to enact first? Getting back and focusing on human behaviors as as you mentioned, the subatomic element of business. It is human behavior is what drives outcomes in terms of business results. And so there's a truism that's been known forever in marketing, which is that if you can get someone somewhere to change their behavior, to pay a higher price for a good or to choose your product over another product, then you're likely going to win the marketing war. That same idea can apply to any sort of move in business. But if you just boil it down to its essence, you cannot change your performance curve. You cannot grow. You cannot improve your margin unless someone somewhere in your operations, it could be a consumer or a customer in your end market, it could be someone working on your factory line, unless someone somewhere changes their behavior. So that's a really important, that's one of the really important principles. The other think differently principle is to bring a beginner's mind. It's actually in the subtitle of the book, and it's something that is being, I think, well talked about, especially in your area of the world, in Silicon Valley these days. It's Mark Benioff has talked extensively about beginner's mind. Steve Jobs believed in it as well. And it's a very simple concept that is stolen from the world of Zen Buddhism. And there's a quote in Suzuki's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which is, and I often get this quote precisely wrong, but it's something along the lines of, in a beginner's mind, there are many options. In an expert's mind, there are few. And so what we're trying to encourage everyone to do as they come to their organizations and consider their processes day in, day out, is consistent with challenging orthodoxy. Bring a beginner's mind and look at it from a different angle. Don't presume that what's happened in the past and the way things have been done in the past is the right way of doing things. Because if you try to bring past expertise to the table in a world of exponential change, you're probably going to get it wrong.
And if you apply the how you think differently to then what you do, what that would lead you to is making minimally viable moves as a start. So, the phrase that we coin in the book, the minimally viable move, is an expansion of the term minimally viable product from the world of design and agile thinking. But we're saying anything that you do in an organization can be done at a small scale to see what happens in the world. So if you're trying to focus on a particular behavior, then what you might say, let's define a test to see if we can actually change some small segment of consumers' behavior to see if this concept works. And thinking in minimally viable moves is a great way to not be wedded to, well, we have to do this because we know that this is what happens. Let's find out what happens if we do something at a small scale. And then importantly, to almost bring it full circle, is you can't get too wedded to anything that is successful in this world, because it could change very rapidly. So you've got to some extent embrace impermanence. So if things start to go differently than your hypothesis started to say, even if it's been historically successful, you've got to be ready to walk away from it and test something else. And therefore we say, don't put too many structures, processes, and systems in place that will prevent you from doing something different, which is something that we observe that, of course, lots of scale companies have today that get in the way of them trying new things. So those would be the 4 principles right here.
And on that last one, the embracing impermanence, that's something that, and a lot of these principles that we talk about in the book are actually things that come naturally to entrepreneurs and startups. I think the interesting thing to watch over the course of the next few years is whether some of these digitally native behemoths are going to be able to continue to bring a beginner's mind and to act in such an agile way that they have historically, because the basic rules of business say that as you grow and get bigger, you need to manage down your risk, and you need to do that by standardizing your work processes. And that's exactly what's led us to the problems that exist in most successful companies of past eras now.
And yeah, I wanted to talk to you about just that sort of thing, because I feel like there is a sort of a tension here between this idea of challenging orthodoxies on the one hand, and the fact that large corporations, big companies kind of exist at all. Because, and I know you touch upon this in the book as well, where you say that, you have entrepreneurs, startups, smaller companies, they are much more used to taking these risks, tinkering with things, trying things out. They don't really see, the stakes for them are just not as high. Startups are generally expected to fail. So when they go out and try these things, it's not such a big deal. And so I wonder, can we look at your book then as any kind of prediction, any kind of blueprint going forward of what we're going to see? Maybe you sort of alluded to it yourself, Geoff. Are we going to see big companies declining in some sense, playing a diminishing role? Are we going to see more startups, more smaller companies come up? Because that's going to be in some sense forced upon us by the exponential pace of change.
Well, the data already says that large successful companies are failing faster than they ever have before. So there's I think we talk in the book about the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 50, 60 years ago was actually 60 years. Today, it's under 20 years and it's dropping. So we now have all sorts of evidence. And by the way, it's been a reasonably steady decline over that time. So we've got all sorts of evidence that the lifespan of a big scaled successful company is dropping and will continue to drop. I don't think that means that the world is going to be taken over by startups. There are still some advantages to scale, and we talk a lot about the various different ways of gaining an advantage in the book. But so that doesn't mean that scale is bad. It does mean that if you're successful and you're a big company today because you've been successful in capturing the playbooks of how you operate, if you can't shift that mindset, then you will go out of business. And I know that probably sounds hyperbolic, but we're starting to see it all over the place.
But just look at those companies who have historically been successful over the last 20 years. You can almost point to them and say they've been restlessly trying to satisfy their customers and very willing to discontinue what they've done in the past and do something different. So look at all the evolutions that a company like Amazon has gone through, from bookseller to narrow retailer to broader retailer to all the various different businesses that they're in today. They've been restlessly trying to satisfy their customers. And the one thing I'd add to what Geoff said is that we do hypothesize in the book that there could be two segments of companies in the world. And so one of the concepts that we say, who knows, this could be the case, is the notion of a pop-up company, and say we could effectively pop up to say there's this opportunity. It's got some length of time that it's going to be relevant for, and we're not going to try and continue to grow in the face. We're going to stick to our knitting and do something really well. And those companies that choose to say, no, we're going to try to last forever, but that's going to require them to continually and restlessly reinvent themselves in the face of new things that are possible given technology evolution and such.
Fantastic. Well, we're almost out of time, guys. So I think just as a final thought, then that leads us on to basically, I think, having this understanding that we should, in some sense, embrace impermanence. And I think companies will have to understand that going forward, that what happened in the past is necessarily no longer any indication of what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, that's right. And going back to something I said at the beginning of the discussion, That doesn't mean going and blowing up everything right now. We are both rational strategists, and we recognize that especially successful public companies have shareholders that they are beholden to, and there are some still very successful business models in place. So we're not saying go throw out everything right now. We are saying make sure you maintain at any given point in time a portfolio of activities. You have to be able to continue to operate your core business if you're a big successful company, because that's what's throwing off cash for the rest of the system. But there's all sorts of other places in your portfolio of activities where you can be trying new things and trying out new business models and making those minimally viable moves. And I think Steve agrees with me that all that's going to happen is the cycle time of new things taking over the core business is going to accelerate. And so if you can be adept at discovering those new things and at innovating and being able to work them into your core business, then you will be able to survive.
Fantastic. Steve, any last thoughts?
No, I would go back and saying that, and what will drive that life cycle is, what is it that's satisfying your customers? And so if you did nothing else and say, I really understand what motivates the behaviors of my customers, and does the thing I'm doing continue to delight them? Is it really intuitive? Is it does it excite them and form habits? Then those are all things that will cause that cycle time to lengthen and the longevity of your business. But to the extent that there are new things that could do it even better, you need to either adopt those things yourselves or be willing to say, well, this thing that I'm doing is going to eventually become irrelevant. So you've got to be relentlessly focused on that behavior.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a great discussion, guys. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap it up there, but I want to thank you both very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
It's been a pleasure. And to all our viewers, I want to remind you that Geoff and Steve are going to be joining us again October 9th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. They're going to be giving a webinar here for us at SVIC. So if you've enjoyed our conversation today, make sure you tune in to that. They're going to have more time, more space to go into more detail on the areas that we've touched upon today. But for now, that's where we'll have to wrap it up. So from me, from my guests, Geoff and Steve, thanks very much for watching us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.